I'm done. Thank you for those of you that are continuing on with the next session. And I'm pleased to have Sriram. He's the Chief of Software and Systems Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Information Technology Laboratory, also known as ITL. Prior to joining NIST, he was on, flip my page, he was on the engineering faculty from 1986 to 1994 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and was instrumental in setting up the Intelligent Engineering Systems Laboratory. At MIT, Sriram initiated the MIT DICE project, which was one of the pioneering projects in collaborative engineering. He has co-authored or authored nearly 300 publications, including several books on artificial intelligence. He's very active in several professional societies, including serving as the chair of the 2021 IEEE Computer Society Fellow Evaluating Committee, steering committee member of AAAS Section T, which is Information Computing and Communication, associate editor of the ACM Computing Surveys, president of the Washington Academy of Scientists, among other activities. Many of his talks on AI, object-oriented systems, cyber-physical social systems, starting from his tenure at MIT in the late 1980s, can be found on the web. For his contributions over the past 4 decades, he has received many awards, including 5 Life Achievement Awards and a Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Madras, India. He has also been made a fellow of prominent societies in engineering, ASME, IET, INCOS, SME, and SMA, computer science, ACM, AIAA, IEEE, medical, AIMBE, and science, AAAS, and WAS societies. So we're pleased to have you here to talk to us.
Thank you, Maxine. You know, I work for the government when you have all those acronyms. As such. Yeah. Anyway, thank you again. My name is Sriram, and I'm going to talk about harnessing digital revolutions for the aging population. Here is the outline of the talk. I have a lot of slides here which are available. Anyone can, I guess, you can give it to people, whoever you want.
We're going to distribute
they want to distribute the slides. Initially, I'm going to talk about something called the 5 horses. You'll see what that is. I'll give you a healthcare vision, and I've been working on something called P9 medicine for the last decade or so. I'll talk about it briefly. When I talk about the digital revolutions that are going to transform the healthcare, I'll discuss a computational framework, some case studies. So, you all watched the movie Oppenheimer? Yes. You all watched, okay, Oppenheimer. You know who this guy is, okay. Now, in that movie, there's a scene where he takes a book out of his of the rack, and he's actually having something affair with some lady there, and she asks what it is. So, and he says that is the Gita. Bhagavad Gita is what he was reading, and he says he always quotes this book called the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually Indian. I guess you can whatever you call it. It's either from a philosophical perspective or religious perspective, but more philosophy in there. And he says, "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds," and he quotes in that. However, forget about the inside of the book. In the outside of the book, you'll always see a cover like this, where there is a person called Krishna, who is actually believed as a god by many Hindus. Behind him, there's Arjuna. There are 5 horses in there, and Krishna is holding those reins, and he's sitting in a chariot. Okay. Now, what are those 5 horses actually? Now, the 5 horses were originally meant to be 5 senses, and Krishna is supposed to be the mind controlling these 5 senses. But being, after 65, you have to have all these age-related diseases. So I thought, well, let me look at the 5 horses differently. So I interpret these 5 horses as following: having the diseases of the old age, neurological, articular is arthritis, cardiovascular, cancer, and metabolic, which is diabetes and a whole host of things. Now, in fact, I think in the audience, I don't want to, because of privacy issues, ask who has any of these diseases, but at least you have 2 to 3 of them, okay? All of us. So that's the way life goes on, you like it or not. So let's look at these horses from this interpretation. And then the reins, which this person Krishna is using to control these things, are exercise. And you heard, actually, so many of the things that I'm talking right now, people have already said yesterday, and they touched upon these things, but I'm going to put this in a different framework here. So what are the reins? Exercise is one of them, and that's very important. And it kind of cures half the diseases. In fact, that's the reason why today, this morning, I walked from the hotel to here, which is 30 minutes, okay? I'm staying at a tight place because I have to practice what I preach. And then sleep is extremely important. You need at least 7 hours of sleep. Some people may need 4 hours for a different reason. Diet and nutrition. Okay, when you have your lunch, you think about what you're eating. Okay, of course, all those things are not that great out there. You see that thing, but there are other things which are good. Like yesterday, there are beans and then vegetables and those kinds of things. And diet and nutrition is extremely one of the important reins. Meditation. I think Dr. Patel yesterday talked about yoga and those kinds of meditation. But meditation is extremely important. I'll tell you why later on. And then finally, the medications. You're all having some kinds of medication or another, okay, for various diseases. Okay. So these are the 5 reins you control. And actually, you know what? My daughter then asked me, Daddy, what about the chariot? Well, this is the fundamental problem. Okay. The problem is that you can have perfectly good diet, good exercise, a good kind of medications that a lot of medications, like for example, rapamycin is something which will help in the age-old process. Peter Attiva talks about a lot of it. And for those of you who read the book called Outlive. So these are the and then there are medications in Ayurveda and other places which are extremely good for you. But however, what happens to the environment? You know, the microplastics that you're drinking all the time. Okay, so these are the kinds of dangerous things. You cannot help it. What about genetics? I can help my genes. Okay, can you help your genes? No. Of course, there's all the genetics part of it, but genetics play a big role. What about the microbiome? In fact, microbiome is the single most important thing right now, controlling your even brain too. Okay, so a number of diseases can be attributed to this bad microbiome. And in fact, it happens like when people take antibiotics, when kids, for example, they've found out that if they take certain antibiotics, they become autistic in a sense, okay? Because it's killing off the good microbiome and the bad microbiome is coming into the picture. So microbiome becomes important. Last but not the least, for those of you who are going and having your glass of wine, be a little bit careful on this thing. Okay? People tout wine as very good for your health and so on and so forth. But the reality of the situation is moderation is okay, but excess is the bad thing. And it creates cancer and all kinds of things. Smoking is, of course, many of you know, but for some reason in Indian movies, the hero is smoking from the beginning till the end for whatever reason it is, okay? And I think what happens is, this is the tobacco companies, they think they lost their case in the United States. They're trying to sell in India. And one way to sell is pay the director, the producer, a lot of money to put smoking, the hero in there so that the kids and everyone gets addicted as such. So these are all dangerous things that are happening right now. Anyway, so let me talk what a future, my vision, a healthcare vision. And if you look at advances that make the future healthcare vision attainable, there it passes 3 paths. 1, advances in healthcare technology. You have the Genome Project. You have the CRISPR and Cas, which is one of the most fundamental advances in genomics that has happened in the last 10 to 15 years. And there's a Nobel Prize, Doudna got a Nobel Prize and Carpenter got a Nobel Prize for this CRISPR and Cas. Keep it, it's very extremely important. Then you have pharmaceutical and nutraceuticals, and then you have a whole lot of work going on medical devices. And in fact, Karen, the dean here, has talked about some, actually that's I call it a medical devices, but an instrument which can detect bacteria on the surface. So these are the kinds of advances that those are happening. Then the other advances is advances in healthcare practice. For example, disease management, evidence-based healthcare, continuum of care. And the Newsweek had this whole article on called the mind-body medicine. And mind-body medicine, why is it important? Because if you look at us, the medicine is not only pathological. Like, for example, if you take the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland axis, that's the one which produces excess cortisol. So what happens is that when people are under high stress, this is the pathway which gets activated and cortisol is produced. Now, this particular cortisol has got all kinds of bad effects on the immune system and so on and so forth, okay? That's one particular direction. Then if you do, for example, in terms of the sociological dimension, you'll see that this actually cortisol level can be put down by interacting with the people around. Like that's the reason why you go to a church, why do you go to a temple, why do you go to a mosque? Because you gather with people around there, and you have a social interaction going on there. And that's extremely important to reduce stress. So then there's a third path, which is more in terms of psychological in a way, is the meditation, which people talk about. So yesterday Jay Patel was talking about meditation. And it's very interesting because meditation, what happens is that what you do is that you are repeating a word. And when you're repeating a word, certain waves in your brain, like alpha, there's a delta or theta waves, they reduce down their frequencies as a result. That has an effect on your cellular on the cells and indirectly have an effect on your immune system. So that's how the things work. So these are, and then remember the meditation I already mentioned in my previous slide too. So that's the mind-body medicine, which is extremely important for, especially, as you're growing old, these things become extreme. And finally, this is what I work in, advances in computing, imaging, and information technology. And you've seen the advances that are happening in software in terms of internet, cloud, AI, data analytics, and so on, speed and storage, networking, communication, imaging, and last but not the least are your mobile personal computing devices. Like, for example, this device that I'm holding, I call it an MPCD because I hardly talk on this as a phone. Most of the time, I'm either emailing or LinkedIn, or Facebook, or one of the social media kind of things. So it's more of a mobile personal computer device. So these are the things which go into this future healthcare vision. Okay, so now that I've given you what the future healthcare vision is going to be, let me talk about a concept that I came up with, which is called, this is where what's happening in various fields going on. It's called the P9 medicine. Now, what is P9 medicine? Okay, so P9 medicine, if you look at medicine as such, one is it has to be personalized. And people talked about it yesterday, I think, how to personalize the medicine. And one of the things is the genetics aspect of it. Like, let's say if you have in your electronic health record, your genome, then you know that certain drugs that you take are useless and certain drugs interact with other drugs. Okay, we'll come to that a little bit later. So medicine has to be personalized for each individual. And all this is possible, by the way. Second is predictive. Using AI techniques and those kinds of things, you can look at your EHR and predict the course of a disease or predict what disease you're going to get in the future. Third one is participatory. Here, the patients will have to be involved with the doctor and the doctors with the patients in a participatory manner. That's the three. Fourth one is preventive. Then in terms of the preventive medicine, you have to prevent before the disease itself happens. As they say, the apple a day keeps the doctor away. In fact, I married a doctor. So, and the P9, and then the medicine has to be precise. And I think this was also mentioned before in terms of when you are doing this diagnosis, when you're doing interpretation and all those things, it will be fairly accurate. So precision becomes extremely important. And the fourth one is pervasive. You want to have made medicine anywhere. I'll tell you some examples, like, for example, rural areas. And if you look at a country like India, 80% are in the rural countries. So good medicine should be provided for them in the villages. Similarly here, like, for example, I'm walking or running, and suddenly I feel that I'm having palpitations and things like that. And my Apple Watch actually tells you, how many of you wear Apple Watches? And this Apple Watch actually predicted that I have atrial fibrillation, and my cardiologist couldn't figure it out before. Okay, this watch told me that. And I went to the cardiologist and he said that, no, you are perfectly fine. You're all your blood results, everything is perfect. You don't have any problem. You took a ECG, no problem. Okay, occasionally it comes. Okay, so it becomes very hard to detect these kinds of things as such. Okay, so the Apple Watch does that. Similarly, you have to make anywhere you need. You can be like sitting in your thing here, and some of you may have some symptoms, which immediately have to take it to the doctor, and the doctor can actually talk to you from there. And I gave a talk in Ford Motor Company about 10 years ago, and I told them, Ford, your cars in the future are actually not for transportation. That's a side effect, but they're healthcare things. Because they're sensing a lot of things in there. In fact, George showed his car, new car, Lexus. By the way, I have a Lexus 2009, has 215,000 miles and is still running perfectly. Okay, but still I bought a new one. So anyway, so it's so you can see the cars have so many sensors in there. They can actually detect. And you are driving down, I don't know which Route 93 or here or Route 95, and suddenly you find yourself in the Harvard Medical Center in the hospital. Okay, why? Because your car detected you're going to have an heart attack, so it will take you there. So those are the kinds of things that are going to be in the future. So pervasive. Privacy is extremely important. You have all your medical things. And I don't know whether you've seen the movie called The Net. Has anyone seen The Net? Okay. So anyway, I'll talk about it later on, but your data should not be leaked to anyone and everyone else in the world. And it has to be protective. Someone can hack into the system. And in fact, in this Net, you can Google, there's a movie by Sandra Bullock. The movie kind of starts with, in the beginning, there was, I think, one of the secretaries of some defense or something like that commits suicide. And because he finds out he has HIV, okay? And he finds out he has HIV because his database has been hacked by someone and they put HIV in there. And his electronic health record showed that. And I don't know what this guy was doing, but he thought he had it. And he, So these are the things that are extremely important. There has to be protective. And finally, medicine has to be priced reasonably. And that is what is called the P9 medicine. Okay, and the first four of them, there's a gentleman named Leroy who should have gotten his Nobel Prize in 1987. He got the Lasker Prize. He came up with it. And I kind of worked with Leroy also. And with Ramesh Jain and Subramaniam, we came out with the P9 kind of thing. So remember the concept P9. Now, what are the digital revolutions which are going to have an effect on all this? How can you make all these things happen? Now, one is the omics revolution. Second is AI. Third is virtual reality or extended reality, and the internet and how it's going to change the world. And all this aided by high performance computing. About 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote this paper called Transforming Healthcare to Digital Revolution, and I outlined how these things are going to transform. And that in case there is also a YouTube video and you have the slides, you can look at that. So for the omics is, yesterday, I guess Jay is not here today, he talked about Om. Om is actually, people you recite Om as a mantra, but actually it's a holistic kind of thing. Om, they say the beginning and the end. So omics means the holistic things. So to understand these things, if you look at the levels of biological information, we go from the DNA level all the way to the ecologist level. So you can have different levels of abstraction. So if you look at the biological scales here, you have the human being typically has 20,000 genes, and those 20,000 genes produce 100,000 plus proteins to 200 plus cell types, 4 tissue types, 12 organ types, and 1 body. And you study each of them in detail. When you study about genes, you have genomics. When you study about proteins and protein-protein interaction, you have proteomics. When you talk about cell structure function, you have cellomics. And then you have tissue, it's called spatiomics. And then you have the clinical medicine, which is really phenomics, is the behavior of the human being. It's called phenomics. All of them are the holistic. You have to look at it from a holistic point of view. And why is that important? It's important for IEEE standards because each one of them involves representation. We'll come to that. And you need standards for this thing. And there's a lot of stuff going on in this world. So in terms of the omics, for those of you in the computer science world, you can see there are a lot of different kinds of networks. One is the gene regulatory network. Here is a simple gene regulatory network in the East. You can see that one gene can affect the other gene, can affect the other gene, can affect the other gene, okay? So in fact, that's what happens. It's very important. Like for example, there are twins. One person has schizophrenia, other person doesn't have schizophrenia. Why? They're supposed to be identical genes, aren't they? Twins are supposed to have identical genes. Why? Because there's something called epigenetics in this gene regulatory network. For one person it gets activated, the other person it does not get activated. Now, from a computational perspective, even for a simple like Helobacterium, you'll see this gene interaction network. These networks become complex. They're all nodes connected to other nodes with some links. So anyone in graph theorists around in the audience, you can know that how this whole thing works. Then you have the protein-protein interaction. That's the genes. Now proteins, the genes actually generate proteins in your body. Now these proteins interacted with one another. Here's an example. There's this obese person out there. Now they give you this thing called GLP-1 agonists. Like for example, Ozempic. Have you ever heard of Ozempic right now? Actually, Ozempic is actually an interesting drug, which is a drug which is for weight loss, but actually it has a lot of effects, good effects on other parts of you, including aging as such. Okay, I'm not asking you to take Ozempic, okay? However, if you want, there is something called Akkermansia, which I take every day. It's a probiotic. Now, Akkermansia also, in addition to helping your gut health, it produces something called the GLP-1 peptide kind of thing. And that's why your hunger is reduced and you lose weight and so on and so forth. And it's very good. So GLP-1 is not only for reducing weight, but it also has other good effects as such. So in this person, in the protein, the person is obese, but then they did a bariatric surgery. When they did the bariatric surgery, the person became healthy. And not only the person became healthy, but the person who was diabetic before became well. Why? Because you study the protein-protein interactions. You'll see when the protein network in the beginning, protein network after that, and you discover certain proteins out there which appeared in the later network and which was not there in the network before. And that's why it's important to study this protein-protein interaction network. Then there is the signal transduction networks. I mean, I'm telling you all this because in computer science, we do a lot of stuff with graphs and interactions. They do a lot of graph analytics in there, and that's why these are important. Signal transduction networks are, again, they tell you how at the cellular level, what happens if something kind of attaches. Like, for example, have you heard of something called SARS-CoV-2, COVID? I mean, I wouldn't have to ask question privately. Most of us probably got it, okay? At some point, if you have not have it, you're lucky. But this happens. And then this is how that system works. Like if you look at the SARS virus, that's how it gets into the cell. Originally, this was when it first came, there's something called the H2 protein, and that it attaches to that protein. But for that virus to come out, there's something called TMPRSS2 protein, which has to go in and clip the top part of it, and the virus gets in there. It so happened some people have mutations for that. That's why when the first wave came in India, not many people died, but the virus itself mutated, so it didn't really require the other one. But why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because you can study what exactly is happening there, and you can introduce drugs in there so that you can break the pathways of how the thing, what is happening, and you can see it right at the bottom. You have that IFN alpha, IFN beta, and interferon alpha and beta are coming there, and you can look in the pathways, and you can attach another protein or something like that in there, another drug in there, so that the whole thing can be. So we can do a simulation of these things. Then you have metabolic networks, and those of you know diabetes and things like that. And people are actually developed this entire human metabolic network in a computer right now, and you can see that website shows you that. These are all the networks in there. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about AI because everyone is talking about AI. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit from a different perspective, from my own perspective in there. Now, first of all, one has to come out, when you talk about AI, what is this thing called intelligence? Now, excuse me, when people talk about intelligence, they all talk about only one intelligence in a single dimension of problem-solving kind of intelligence like this, where you're solving problems effectively while adapting to changing contexts and requirements to achieve specific goal. However, actually, and they give some attributes to intelligence, okay? You can understand, you can solve problem, you can generalize, you can do all these things. However, actually, intelligence is multidimensional. There's a guy named Howard Gardner who wrote this book, Frames of Mind. It talks about multiple intelligences. Take your kids, for example. One kid may be extremely good in solving problems. The other could have musical talent, and that's also an intelligence. So you don't, when people talk about artificial intelligence, what are you trying to emulate around here in the computer? Are you trying to emulate problem-solving things? Are you trying to emulate social skills? Are you trying to emulate the musical skills? What are you trying to emulate? So that's why you have to keep in mind when people talk about artificial intelligence. But is it a simplistic view of an AI system? And the way this works is you have the environment. And one of the things that we do is, like, as you go across, we have sensors. So that's a perception part of it. My eye, I'm looking at all of you. Some of you are nodding. Some of you may be watching, I don't know, something on your iPhone. A lot of times it happens, okay? And doing so on and so forth, okay? But I'm just kind of observing you. That's my sensor information. My brain is the intelligent agent, which is doing some reasoning part of it. And then there's an action. Now, the action could be either what I'm speaking right now, or when I ask you a question. And ask you a question, you can like go I'm asking a question right now. How was your breakfast? Okay, now you got to think, where did I have my breakfast and how it was and things like that. And then you're going to respond to me as such. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is manipulation. When you talk about robotics are actually do things, and especially for the aging, it's very, very important. So there are several waves of this AI, which people get confused again. Nowadays, when people talk about AI system did this, they're confused with the second wave. But there was a first wave called the knowledge-based system wave, which in 1980s, this is what I worked on, which is a symbolic kind of computing where you represent, where you have this inference mechanism, which is a thinking process, which has all these things. And then you have your rules and ontologies, which are extremely important. And that's how you represent your knowledge into the thing. Now, the second wave, and this was in the 1980s, and the second wave came around, actually, it was there in the 1980s. I guess a guy named Jeff Hinton. Has anyone heard of him? Actually, Jeff Hinton got a Nobel Prize last year for neural networks. So he was working in 1980s and really nothing too much happened out there. And the reason why that computationally it became very expensive. And the reason why it was computationally expensive is because they were trying to put all this, that's a human brain, and it consists of a set of neurons, and neurons are talking to one another. And they try to represent that particular thing in the multi-layer perceptron model. And then if you look at it carefully, there's an input and there's an output. and there's a lot of weights in there. So everything is connected to everything. And if you want to do computations, you have these large matrices, and people talk about the billions of these matrices, and you do computation. So what happened is, as luck would have it, NVIDIA actually was developing chips for graphics manipulation. And it so happens that all these graphical manipulations require matrix multiplication. So they built chips for matrix multiplications, which was actually useful for this one. So neural networks took off because you can do actually computation. And NVIDIA stock took off. We all bought NVIDIA stock. I wish I had done that, okay? And, the NVIDIA stock also went through the roof. So there was a symbiotic relationship between the neural networks and NVIDIA people. So that's what the AI chips are all about. And then the people have used this for several things. And here is an example. There's something called convolution networks. There's a lot of work which went on in neural networks. And this is the convolutional neural networks, which was used for detecting diabetic retinopathy. So you kind of teach the neural network with a lot of these images, and then you say whether the person has got severe or mild diabetic retinopathy. So what the neural networks were doing at the time is really, this was almost a decade ago, they are kind of learning a function. So you teach this neural network with a lot of data of cats and show this is a cat. It learns a function called the cat function, and then it can do that. But it cannot do a lot of other things, like why determine it's a cat and so on and so forth. It won't do it. But then some of the things people were talking about in DARPA project at the time is that they wanted to do it and explainable, like the neural network to tell you why determine it was a cat and not a rat. Okay, so that's the thing. So then people have done several extensions to these neural networks called the variational autoencoders, generative adversarial networks, which is GANs, and people have used it for large language models. You're all familiar with that, large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude AI, all these things are large language models, but these are a kind of neural networks. And diffusion models, which, like, I don't know, you have seen this AI generated pictures which look real and things like that. And so they use these things called diffusion models to do these things. So these are all neural networks based, but again, as luck would have it, in 2018 or so, someone wrote a paper called transformer models, and these were very useful to generate for large language models. Okay, but these neural networks can be fooled, by the way. Like, for example, if you look at this state of the art, I mean, they used some neural network and taught it what a guitar was and what a penguin was. And someone kind of made a change here at a different picture, photo, the data was trained for that. But what happened is, in this case, this data, a new set of data was put in, a new image was put in, but it thought that was a guitar and that was a penguin. It has nothing to do with guitar, nothing to do with penguin. So what you can do in these neural networks, you can manipulate at the data level, you can manipulate at the output level, and you can manipulate at the input, the learned function level. Like, for example, here, Tesla's neural network system was taught for learning about stop signs. And some wise guy put a post-it note out there, and he thought it was 35 miles per hour. So you're fooling it at the output level. So there was a book called AI Snake Oil, which is very good. You should read it if you have not read it. If you are working in AI, you should read this book, written by Arvind Narayan and Shreyas Kapoor. And there's a guy named Daniel Kahneman. I don't know how many of you have heard of him or not. He actually wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And what he said was, if you look at, like, for example, if I come to this room suddenly dimly lit, and there's a rope which is like that hanging out around there, and like if you're from India, first thing you'll think is it's a snake, and then you'll kind of go back. And that's system one. And the system two is that then what's a snake doing in Tufts University? Maybe there are not many snakes around here. You go into a logical reasoning, and then you say, well, yeah, this is probably a rope. So that's a reasoning number two. Remember the knowledge-based system thing I talked about? That's system two. And neural networks is a system one. So, and then another thing, good book which came out is Gary Marcus and Ernest Davis. About 10 years ago, they told them all this generative, all this large language model stuff is baloney. They're all this hallucinating. Actually, these people talk about hallucinations. Have you heard of that? They say this ChatGPT hallucinates. Actually, ChatGPT doesn't hallucinate, it bullshits. That's what it does. Because that's what happens. You don't know if you're randomly generating sentences, some bullshit thing comes out there and you think it's truth. So it has become very good, by the way, but they kind of look seemingly intelligent, but they're not really intelligent. Okay, there's all these arguments going on. At 1997, I wrote a book called Intelligent Systems for Engineering when I was at MIT. I used to teach a course, and there I talked about knowledge-based systems, but somehow I inserted a chapter on neural networks. And then I speculated how neural networks should be working with knowledge networks. We're talking about 20 years ago. And the third wave is called the symbolic, neurosymbolic computing, and that's what we are seeing right now. And neural networks are very good at those things in terms of recognizing patterns, but they're not very good at explaining anything. And knowledge networks are very good at symbolic reasoning. So what happens if you combine both these things? If you combine both neural networks and symbolic networks, and this is exactly what you are doing, what people are doing right now. And in fact, if you ask Gemini AI, are you using any knowledge-based reasoning? And it says, yes, I am doing. Because when you ask a question, it actually puts it in some kind of a graph and does some knowledge reasoning and then picks a particular sentence and sends it to this large language model. You have to have this. If you don't have this kind of a thing, it's disaster. Because the ChatGPT and all of them are producing garbage, and the garbage will have to be moderated properly. Okay, so, and then the other thing that you are seeing right now is something called agentic AI. Have you heard of that, agentic AI? Actually, agentic AI right now that you hear of is a good old Blackboard framework developed at Carnegie Mellon University by Raj Reddy and all, where they came up with this Blackboard architecture where you had all these knowledge sources interacting, and there is a, like someone is monitoring and so on and so forth. And if you replace that by master agent and agents, it becomes agentic framework. This in my book, chapter 6 talks about that in more detail. I'm not trying to sell my book; I can give it to you free. But so then there's another thing at Carnegie Mellon. Sharas Talukdar and other people came up with this thing called A-Teams, which is another exciting technology, which I think people, for some reason, I still don't understand. People are not using this, which should be used. Is that what they said was that there are these things called construction agents, improvement agents, evaluation agents, and destruction agents. There are all these agents which don't know anything about any other agent. They're just forming the solution. Like you're all here, you're all proposing solutions, but you don't know what the other person is going to propose. Like, for example, George wants to know about what is the future for age tech. And all he's doing is asking individually questions, and each one of you are proposing a solution, but you don't know what the other person is proposing. And then there is one other person who's critiquing that and say, the old people, they don't like this particular way of doing things, so let's throw it out and so on and so forth. So that's a new way of doing it. And again, another book which talks about how this one kind of works, okay? So now the other thing which people talked about is robotics. So AI is part of the robotics thing. And the reason why robotics are very important for old people, I mean, this whole definition of robots and so on, is that they actually do the manipulation. Okay, like especially when you have one of those articular diseases like I have, you got to, after some time it becomes hard to walk, so you need an aid kind of thing. And these are very useful exoskeletons and those kinds of things. And people who have neurological diseases also, you have these exoskeletons kind of helping in this process. So in medicine, they're being used quite a lot, the robotics part of it. And as you grow old, you'll see the one at the right hand, the paraplegic kind of person, robotics is helping those kinds of process. So that's the thing in robotics. So AI can be used for a lot of things around here. If you look at this life cycle, we talk about from the embryo to the time when you die, in the hospital is value-based care. AI is used at several levels. And actually, it's a multi-dimensional kind of thing. It's a life cycle dimension. There's an organ type. You have the ocular, you have thoracic, breast, the gastrointestinal. So you can get diseases in any one of them, and your life cycle can go on. And and then there are different types of problems: diagnosis, interpretation, monitoring, control, treatment planning, and design of drugs, design of the hospital system, and so on. And depending on where you are, you pick up the appropriate strategy, whether I use knowledge-based systems, whether I use neural networks, what kind of neural networks do I use, how do I combine these things? Okay, so much for the AI. And the third one is extended reality or augmented reality. I'm not going to go too much into this thing, except that people are talking a lot about this thing, and you have to look at it a little bit careful, because, and the reason is for some people who have cognitive disorders, especially, you can use therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, and you can use this virtual reality kind of techniques to help them in this process. So this virtual reality, not only they're useful for understanding the surgery, understanding the implications of what you're going to do, they're also useful in the neurological kind of diseases. Okay. Then we have finally the internet, which I call the smart network systems and societies. This was something which I came up about in 2013. Vint Cerf, which actually is the father of internet, and I held a workshop at IEEE's, and this is kind of an output. So if you look at the internet, I don't know, some of us have been in 1969. I know George is laughing out there when this thing started, but some of you may not. But most of you should be probably from that point, okay, since this is a evolution conference for 65 plus, I guess. Okay? So you must have heard about all these things, how this evolved kind of thing, okay? So let me see what's happening right now. If you look at it, if you have the physical world and you have the environment and you have the networks and you have things connected to people. So these things are actually sensing and acting. For example, my iPhone, my watch is constantly sensing me. Your watches are, and the telephones are recording you. And in fact, my wife refuses to use Siri because she thinks someone is recording her all the time. And that happens, like you never know who's doing what. So then you have these things called the Internet of Things and cyber-physical systems. George may be familiar with that because there's whole thing called smart grid and so on and so forth. This is part of this whole process. You have what is known as a cooperative cyber-physical systems. We have the cyber-physical systems connected to one another. So if you look at an hospital environment, you can see that they're fairly well instrumented. If you look at it, if you are admitted into I hope none of you have been admitted in the recent past, but you never know if you have an accident or something like that. There are all kinds of equipment, ventilators, and so on and so forth. And then they're calculating various parameters, and you do these kinds of things. So then you have this thing called the society, which is happening. There are the formal social organizations, and then like the hospitals and so on. So what are known as the cyber-physical human systems. So you can see here that there's a doctor's offices connected to the wards, to the nursing stations, and hospitals are connected to other hospitals through this network of ambulances and so on. And then finally, what we have witnessed in the last couple of, at least in the last 2 decades or so, are the social networks like LinkedIn, Facebook, and so on and so forth. And you can see, and everywhere there's sensing, like these things are physical sensing, there's something as the social sensing. People don't know about social sensing. Just like sensing physical things, on the social networks, you can sense certain things too, and that's called social sensing. There's a whole lot of things about sensors. I'm not going to get into it, but essentially, when you have this interconnected cyber-physical systems and social networks, you now have the smart network systems and societies. And here is an example of hospitals, doctors, patients connected to one another. Okay, so now I'm going to describe a computational framework of how all these things fit together. Like for that, I need to define a health persona. Now, this is what happens. Like you have what are known as, I said, logical sensors. There's different kinds of sensors, like your calendar, the GPS, whatever it is. These are logical sensors getting information into your daily calendars. Then a fitness tracking sensor, like the Fitbit. Anyone use Fitbit here? Apple, you use Apple thing. Fitbit you use, and then there's physiological sensors like for the asthma people are getting your blood, arrhythmia, all those things I talked about, and the Apple Watch is actually detecting those kinds of things. And then food eating, like you're eating. In fact, actually in the future, before you actually take the food, you take a photograph of that and it'll tell you, boy, this is high calorie, a lot of sugar in there. It's not really good for you. And then you are actually diabetic. So please don't eat this kind of stuff in there. So that's food is extremely important. And then you have the kinetic event and physiological events happening. And this is called the health persona, number one. So then what happened is, I think most of you go to doctors. I suppose so. And most of these doctors use what are known as electronic health records. In fact, there's a big problem of interoperability of these electronic health records. In fact, if you go to a hospital and they use an electronic health record, that particular electronic health record has to be tested or certified before the doctor uses it. And all the tests for certification is done by my division. My group does that before it goes. I'm not going to go into that because that's not the part of this talk. Except that these electronic health records are going to get information from all kinds of sources. I think George kind of mentioned interoperability here because you're getting data from labs and MRI and those kinds of things. And you're getting the genomic data also, you're getting into that thing. And like, for example, the reason why this genomic data is important is that if there's a gene mutation of this CYP2, C1, C19, and if we give that person as a stroke, and even if you have any friends who might have had strokes, and this one won't work because there's a gene mutation for that. So it's extremely important. Remember I talked about right in the first P in terms of both prediction, prevention, and those kinds of things. All the P's come into this picture, okay? So then you add this to this health persona, you have what is known as a personal health record. So that's, and every one of us is going to have a personal health record, by the way, in the future. We're all going to carry these personal health records. So then you have this personal health record, you take the information on the social networks, you have the environmental data, and now there's a big thing going on digital twins, as some of you know. And I think there was a talk also yesterday on some kind of a digital twin. And then you put in this thing called the Blackboard, which I talked about before, which is an AI system. Now, the output of this is actually the disease risk assessment, treatment plans, and wellness recommendations. So I'm now going to talk about in the next 10 minutes or so some case studies. First thing I'll talk about Alzheimer's disease. Now, I think many of you have someone in your family who suffers some neurological disease, and Alzheimer's could be one of them. Okay, as you grow old, Alzheimer's is going to attack you. So let's first look at the Alzheimer's disease. Now, what happens in Alzheimer's disease is there are two pathways actually. There is what is known as an APO4 mutation of the two genes. If you have those things, you'll get these things called the amyloid plaques. You must have heard of this amyloid plaques in the brain for people who had this Alzheimer's disease detected. And then there's a second pathway, which is called the tau pathway. Okay, what happens is there is a protein called tau, which gets hyperphosphorylated. As a result of that, you have this neurofibrillary tangles. So that is the second pathway. And Alzheimer's, both the pathways are important. Okay, and the reason why some of these drugs don't work is that they're attacking one pathway and not the other pathway. And some people may not have the amyloid plaques, but they may have the neurofibrillary plaques. So why am I talking about this thing? Because remember, neurological things is one of them. And how do you prevent it? How do you use technology to do that thing? Here is what we did. Okay, we worked with the NIH to determine what causes it. What causes the hyperphosphorylation of the tau protein? And what happens is that there's something called the CDK5, cyclin-dependent kinases 5. Like actually, when cell divides, there are the cyclin-dependent kinases 1, 2, 3, 4. They are the ones which are responsible for the cell cycle. But there's something called the CDK5, which is the fifth one, which plays a major role in your neurological processes. Actually, what happens is that that one interacts with something called P35 in the brain. There's a protein P35, and normal interaction, it's okay. But then for some reason, what happens is that gets cleavage in the bad pathology. P35 becomes 25, and then when that attaches itself with CDK5, then you have your tau tangle. The tau tangle. What is that? The neurofibrillary things are the tau tangles in there. Okay? Or actually, the tangles are whatever they call them. Okay. So this is actually, and then there are other kinds of things that are happening out there. And what we do is that we do what are known as the in silico experiments. NIH does the in vitro experiments, and we do the in silico. We try to understand the computer. Like, what happens if I take something called P5? We take the protein, the peptide, and P5, which is only a very small peptide. I think maybe it has 5 proteins or what, I don't know what it is. P5, we introduce that. We threw a simulation in the computer to see how this P5 interacts with the rest of the things. And it so happens it inhibits the whole process. So now this will lead to drug design. So then we have, do you remember someone asked you a question in terms of, do you know Monte Carlo simulations? Okay, so that's what we do, molecular dynamic simulations. And then what we do here is that right now what we are working on is using the AI generative techniques to generate all kinds of possible interactions of these peptides. Like I can introduce zillions of these peptides like P5, and then do a simulation about and then do an AI type of generation on that thing and do and see which are the ones which are likely to help in this process. So that's how AI comes into this picture. Okay, now let me talk about asthma. And you probably know people who suffer from asthma. Do you? Okay, a lot of people suffer with, I think 1 in 12 kind of suffer with asthma. So remember the thing that I kind of talked about before, and now I'm going to go a little bit faster here. You're going to have 10 minutes. If you look at this particular one here, you look at all the sensors on the top, that's the physical sensors that are out there, which are measuring air quality. Okay. So air quality sensors are all over the place. They're measuring the air quality. Here, the air quality AQI is, air quality index is about 250. Then you have the social networks. People are coughing. So they input the thing in the Facebook and say, I'm coughing and so on and so forth in a particular region. Okay. And then they post the thing, the location. And then you remember we have the health persona of a particular person. So the person is prone to asthma. Now the person is running somewhere in the Tufts University area, something like that. Now the air quality index is high. This person is prone to a thing. So immediately there's an AI system which kind of determines that this person needs to get out of that place and tells the person to go elsewhere. And these kinds of things can happen on a day-to-day basis. Remember the car I told you, you're driving the car and you're in the hospital. So this is the framework for this, and we can make this happen. And finally, let me talk about scientific wellness. Okay, now people talked about yesterday about the biological clock and the chronological clock. There are two things. Now, the chronological clock is your age, like you may be 69, but biologically, you may be only 50, because there's a biological age and the chronological age. So you need to, blood can actually help you to determine what's your biological age if you do all these blood tests. So blood is a window into wellness and disease. So what you do is that you take the results of the blood, whenever you go to the doctor, they do lab tests, take all the information on the blood, and then you integrate that along with all these networks that I talked about. Remember the genomic networks and so on and so forth. And then what you can do is that you can use AI techniques or large language, whatever it is, to determine the possibility of this particular person going to have a particular disease like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or some of the metabolic diseases and so on and so forth. What's the progression of that? So what you do is in a conventional medicine, what happens right now is the onset of the disease happens somewhere. Like you might have had Alzheimer's 20 years ago. And it doesn't, only when there's a clinical diagnosis happens much later on. But what you should do is that using this whole network, by the way, this is due to Leroy Hood. If you kind of find out, like here is the first detectable phenomic changes in that person in terms of the blood, in terms of the networks and so on, then you do a treatment of that. Because as a result of that, instead of going the top path, you go the bottom path. So that in other ways that you return to wellness, you're not going to get the disease because you intervened in the right place. And that's why this is important. So, you can see that this is a recent past. There's this Penny Ashford who was age 67, and she had this high, the tau protein, p-tau protein 217, and she had it very high. And she went on to Mediterranean diet. Remember the reins of the horses that I talked about. She went on the diet, exercise, lost about 30 lbs. She gained some muscle mass, and her p-tau 217 dropped by about 43%. If it is not that, she definitely would have gotten Alzheimer's, but now probably not. Okay, those are the kinds of things that you need to keep in mind. And Eric Topol wrote this book called Super Ages. Has anyone read this thing? Super Ages. If you have not, you should read it. Okay, heard of it, but you should definitely read the book where he talks about, here are the various parameters like p-tau 217. There is the APOE genotype. You do active surveillance on the retina, biomarkers, MRIs, and then there's all this preventive strategies that you can do. So prevention is better than cure kind of thing. So here is an example where now you take the blood biomarkers and take all the images in there and combine both of them together now. And that's the kind of thing which is happening. And so now we've got information from the blood, information about the images, and then you can predict much, much better. Sometimes imaging may not be useful as such because it may be expensive, MRI and things like that, but keep in mind. In fact, we did a report imaging as a biomarker about 2008 timeframe, and was talking about using imaging as a biomarker, just like the blood. So what is it in for NIST? Because here I come to standards. Standards come in different ways, like you have the physical standards. Like for example, you're taking the blood, you're taking the cholesterol level, you're taking the p-tau 217 level. All those things will have to be standardized and traceable. So the physical standards. Then you have the standardization of the nomenclature and data, as well as harmonization of these things. Like for example, you can collect data from one country, data from another country, and they will have to be harmonized. So you have to be, standards will have to be developed for this particular case. Okay, yeah, I'm almost done. Okay, so you have the standardization of nomenclature, data harmonization. And so this is extremely important. I don't think any of the organizations are doing standardization on this thing. So it'd be very good for IEEE standardization to get into this, along with the framework that I mentioned. Remember all the sensors, all of them actually required to be, if you're getting sensor data from your, Fitbit kind of thing, and all kinds of sensor, it'll be good to have a standard for all these things, okay? So once you do that, then you have, like this is the one, then you combine that to your genomic kind of thing. So you have a extremely useful framework for scientific wellness. Okay, so I'm going to summarize right now. So biological systems are inherently adaptable. They kind of adjust dynamically to environmental changes. So environment is very important. And there's a lot of changes in multi-scale modeling. For example, interactions of various subsystems. And these subsystems interact with the microbiome. Microbiome is very important. So we need a systems engineering approach for this kind of thing. And standards are extremely important in making this thing happen. And this is a role that I think IEEE can play. And AI will play a major role in enhancing healthcare for all. And that's my sales pitch. So we need measurements and data sets to evaluate these health IT frameworks, which people are coming up with. Okay. So again, 5 horses revisited. So you have the diseases, neurological, arthritis, or articular, cardiovascular, cancer, and metabolic. And then you have all those ranges like diet, exercise, and so on. And then you have problems like environment and so on and so forth. And then we solve all this by using AI, omics, internet, and extended reality. Okay. So, pardon? And so we have all the smart devices you're talking about. People are talking about all kinds of smart devices. People are talking about smart networks, smart processes, smart planet. Everything is smart, including smart toilets. In fact, if you go to Japan, you go to the toilet, they'll actually determine what your microbiome is. And they'll kind of tell you that, hey, listen, you didn't eat good food last time. Tomorrow, everyone can go to the toilet and check your microbiome.
There's real-time analysis of the toilet?
Yeah. They do that. Yeah. The toilets do that. Anyway, people talked about robotics and things like that. And this slide, it's about 10-year-old slide and still true. This is an age-old thing. You fall down and the robot comes in and kind of helps you out into the thing. That's a 21st century doc. And here are the 3 books which I found very useful. Outlive by Peter Attiwa, Science of Scientific Wellness by Leroy Hood, which all the scientific wellness things that I talked about is in this book. And I think #1 book is Super Ages by Eric Topol. This is the best book if there's only one book that you have to read, read Super Ages and then read the scientific wellness. Peter Attiwa's Outlive is very good too, but depends. If you have all the time in the world, I think you should read. Not all that, you don't need to have all the time in the world. I read all of them through what is known as Audible. Yeah. So you don't need to read them, you can just listen to them. Okay, that's about, I think I'm within my time. Thank you very much. It all depends on Maxine, I have time for questions.
We do have time for a few questions. Yeah, Joseph. Oh, let me do Joseph and then I'll come to you.